So eine Minute warten wir noch. Herzlich willkommen hier in Zürich im MEEET-Lab, was ich vorher gelernt habe, Medium, Existential, Encounter Involving Technik. Mein Name ist Gernot Meier, ich führe Sie heute durch den Abend. Die Veranstaltung findet auf Englisch statt, das heisst, nach meiner ersten Worte jetzt in Baseldeutsch wird es nachher ganz in Englisch sein. Ich wünsche allen einen schönen Abend und ich freue mich sehr auf die Veranstaltung zu Nexus. A warm welcome to guests here for the discussion on the book of Nexus from Yuval Harari. The focus for this evening is the book Nexus. I'll read something from the last side. Stories brought us together, books spread our ideas and mythologies, the internet promised infinite knowledge, the algorithm learned our secrets and then turned it against us. What will AI do? These sentences are written from Yuval Noah Harari. He was born 1976 in a little village near Haifa, and he is a professor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has written many books like A Brief History of Humanity, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and he had reached many peoples worldwide. Harari combines historical scholarship with philosophy, technology, assessment, and often provocative theses about the future. His latest book, Nexus, explores the questions of how information system shapes our societies and what happens when information no longer serves truth but efficiency, when machines decide before people understand. 665 pages, a very thick book about human networks, the inorganic network and computer policy. There are some reviews on the book. The Guardian writes, Nexus is stark warning about the power of information networks and manipulate human behavior. The Times criticized redundancy and superfallacy, familiar ideas, nothing new, and no analytical depth. Wired, the Vogue for nerds, emphasizes information is not truth. In a free information market, fiction always prevails. And some German newspapers are written, triviality, vague use of terms, humanity is reductionism. So, now I want to introduce the guests. First, on my left side, Professor Dr. Beth Singler, anthropologist and expert on the cultural perception of AI. Since October 2020, she is an assistant professor in digital religions and a co-director of this part at the University Research Center, previously at the University of Cambridge. She works on religion, myth, and narratives about AI and society. Professor Dr. Dirk Helbing, physicist, sociologist, and complexity researcher. Professor of computational science here at the ETH in Zurich. Research areas, digitalization, social networks, ethical regulation of AI. And last, Professor Dr. Thomas Schlag, Protestant practical theologian and responsible for religious education. Professor here at the Zurich University, director of the University Research Center for Digital Religions, which have been running since 21. Head of the Center of Church Development. Focus areas, Theology in the Digital Age, Ethics and Social Change. And they are both co-directors here of the MEEET-Lab, as I understand it right. My name is Gernot Meier. I work at the Barton Church, and I work also in the University of Heidelberg, and I work at the University of Applied Science in the direction of mechanics and, how do you call that? Computer science and informatics. So, let's begin. Yuval Harari and Mark Zuckerberg having a discussion. And then he said, in the past, we only had two types of information, things that were true and things would be false. Now we have a third category, things that are spread by algorithms because they generate engagement, regardless if they're true or wrong. In further discussions with technology ethicist Tristan Harris, Harari formulates, we are not facing a technological crisis, but a philosophical crisis. These statements reflect the profound ethical and societal questions raised about the impact of technology. Though, the question for the first round, from the perspective of your own discipline, where does Nexus resonate most deeply? Or where do you find yourself in strongest disagreement with Harari's thesis? I would like to ask first Beth Singler by starting describing for your perspective, and then Dirk Helbing, and then Thomas Schlag.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction as well, which points out that as an anthropologist, I'm thinking about narratives and stories and the ways in which those elements in our conception of the world shape the world, in fact. And I think what's useful, in a sense, with Nexus is to think of it as a narrative, that Yuval Noah Harari is telling a particular story about our histories by picking up specific elements of evidence that he considers to fit into that narrative. So of course we could argue for a different narrative, but I think it is a useful book to start provocatively with and say that he has a vision of a direction of travel, a telos for AI that is going to become increasingly engaged in our society, increasingly agential in the way that it works, that it will make decisions on our behalf. And his concerns that he raises in the book are a good starting point for a discussion. Now, I don't agree with everything that he writes in the book. I think, as you said, I say that it could be a different narrative written in a different direction with different evidence from wider perspectives around the globe. His focus is often European and North American. There are some elements in his selective use of history that I think are limited, as some of the reviews also mentioned. He does occasionally have a comment to make about the role of corporations, but doesn't really engage with the intrinsic capitalistic nature of the artificial intelligence that is currently being built. So there are positives and negatives. I was saying just earlier, I think I probably found more to nod my head to in Nexus than I did with Homo Deus, a previous book, because his approach in that book on the subject of religion I was closer to, perhaps. This idea of the information age is directly related to my work on AI, but I think as a religious studies expert, I could see where he was skipping material that would have been useful for talking about the sociology and anthropology of religion. But good things and bad things. It's a good place to start a conversation, at least.
Is there a combination in your mind between Homo Deus and Nexus?
There is again this assumption of the direction of travel for AI, that it will become exponentially more impactful. It reminds me a lot, the other day I ran into a Google engineer at a parent thing at my son's school, and he was very insistent in our conversation about AI that the AI we have today is the worst AI we will ever have.
Okay.
It will only get better. It will only succeed in particular domains and become more and more useful. Now, I'm agnostic on that belief, but I can point to evidence such as the degeneration of outputs of AI because of the slop that is being regurgitated into generative AI to say there are limiting factors on the development of AI. So again, with Homo Deus and with Nexus, he has this vision of AI only ever exponentially improving. So we can critique that, for instance.
Yeah, Yuval Harari, I think, is looking at history from a new angle, and that's the angle of information flows. He is contrasting at least two kinds of systems, democratic and autocratic/totalitarian, and that it would be characterized by centralized information flows, while the former democratic systems would be characterized by decentralized information flows. That's an idea that I can follow and support. Moreover, he's mentioning that democracies are characterized by self-correction mechanisms, while autocratic systems are not. I do think, however, that he misses out a lot of other characteristic elements of social and societal systems, democracies in particular. So if we look at democracies and digital democracies in particular, we look at it from the point of view of values, such as they are encoded, for example, in the Constitution or the United Nations Charter of Human Rights. We look at issues such as human dignity. I think something that has been totally neglected by the digital revolution so far, largely at least. I'm missing the discussion of collective intelligence, how it comes about, and what are the potentials of this, how it can be promoted, how we can build societies on that. He's not discussing voting a lot. Also the rule of and role of culture, I think, is omitted largely, and complexity. I'm a complexity scientist, as it was pointed out before, and I think this adds a very important perspective, because society as well as economies are complex dynamical systems, networked systems too, and those systems are characterized by certain kind of features. They're being made up of many components that could be individuals or companies or institutions that interact with each other, but they interact with each other non-linearly or through network structures. And as a result of that, self-organization happens. Those systems have some characteristic eigendynamics, some specific properties that do emerge as a result of interaction of those many components. So it's not, society is not just a collection of separated individuals. What really matters is how we interact with each other and what comes about as a result of that. And I think equally, history could be looked from the perspective of all those perspectives that I've just mentioned, and he chooses to focus on the information flows and the self-correction mechanisms. But I think it's fine to choose such a perspective, and it gives new insights from my point of view, but it does not give a complete account of the entire problem area.
Is there some point you think this is very special in the book of Harari, where you think by yourself, well, this is something new, something special, something you find yourself in the reading that's a new point for you?
I mean, this book is full of historical anecdotes or historical accounts that basically paint the picture of his story. And I was always, of course, interested in how will it end, you know. So can we say something whether the digital revolution will create a totalitarian or a democratic system, or what will happen? And I would say we don't get a definite answer to this question, but there is an indication that totalitarian systems, no matter how cruel and brutal, they would always fail eventually. But that can be said perhaps for all systems that we've seen so far, so we still don't know how will the future look like, and that makes the future so exciting.
Right. Coming back to your question, what resonated most in preparation of this evening, I was actually also looking up a little bit on current discussions about the book, as you also did, but more on YouTube and stuff. And I found a discussion with Yuval Harari done by the chief editor of The Atlantic. Maybe somebody has seen it. It's about an hour 20 or something, where he explains his ideas about the book and has been asked about questions of how will it be in the future and so forth. And the final sentence of the discussion, or of Harari himself, was, I hope that, and this is more or less to quote, I hope that companies like Microsoft and Google will in the future employ theologians. Final sentence. And that somehow resonated to me, as you might imagine. So starting with that point, I found in the book most interesting that in this very broad debate on AI already, very, very many aspects, political aspects, economic aspects, and so forth, that Harari now actually went into looking into the religious dimensions of the whole debate. So as a theologian, I find that quite interesting, and not very often happens that people dealing with the field are actually also taking this perspective of religion into the whole debate. And for us, and you mentioned our research program on digital religions, it somehow supports, a book like that supports our interest in doing research in the field, because now we can always say, you know, Harari already said, so we need more third-party funding. No, but so I like that, and I find that still surprising, the approach, and we will probably talk about how he perceives the religious dimension. But just as a starting point, I find that very interesting, and I think for a theologian, it's especially having an author who's actually somehow perceived worldwide in a certain sense, to actually try to see how he works and what his arguments are. And the other thing, which also resonates, is a little bit connected to it, but it might be a broader idea of Harari, I'm not quite sure. He very intensely uses the term wisdom, starting with it right from the start of the book, and also ending with it. And I was wondering what that means, actually. So what kind of wisdom does he mean? Do we need? And it's obviously not only a kind of religious wisdom. Maybe it's not religious at all. We have to see. His background, of course, is the Jewish religion. But on the other hand, he's also very critical towards religion. So I was surprised, seeing, well, how does he use this term throughout the whole book? And I'm happy and looking forward to discussing this. So that resonated in me, and so I did not have the feeling that I wasted time by reading the book at least once, maybe even twice, and which is not happening with every book I have to read.
Let's have a look at the term wisdom. You both come to this point, to this word, as a special point from Harari?
So I'm interested as well what he means by wisdom, because we have classical wisdom traditions.
Yeah.
And we also have this more intuitive sense that wisdom is something that machines can't do. I think that's coming out in his discussion of intelligence. He's wanting to separate those two things quite distinctly, and say there's something perhaps more that humans can do in this discussion, bringing with them wisdom, common sense, intuitions, all the elements that are devoid in the machine-like intelligence that he talks about. I think there's some very interesting parts, and I was saying to some people earlier, my other book project I was reading this week was on flying saucers and aliens. So I have a lot of alien conversation in my head at the moment. But he talks a lot about alien intelligence. So rather than calling it artificial intelligence, he suggests it becomes so advanced, it's better to think of it as an alien intelligence amongst us, and that he's not the only person who holds that particular perspective. But in doing so, he's sort of drawing on the science fiction cultures that tell us aliens will be devoid of some element of humanity. You see it a lot in Star Trek with characters like Spock. The Vulcan doesn't have the emotional element, and when he does have the emotional element, it doesn't go so well for him. this idea that something unique to humanity is coming through when he's saying the word wisdom.
Yeah.
I think he's drawing on a lot of these sorts of implied connections, but maybe I'm also reading too much into it because I really like Star Trek, who knows?
But is it not interesting that, I mean, looking into all the AI ethics debates, into all the also philosophical debates about AI, you very rarely find the use of the term wisdom. You find question about consciousness, intelligence, mindsets, whatsoever. But so I was a little bit surprised that he actually used that term. It might actually be the case that this is a category to try to differentiate between what humans can do and what machines will maybe never be able to do. We'll just have to see. And so I found that quite inspiring.
The times I have heard wisdom in the AI ethics debate specifically have been when religious leadership has said, we have centuries of wisdom, the wisdom traditions we can bring with us to this conversation. So yeah, this is something slightly different to that in his book, I think.
Yeah, people often say data is the new oil. And this basically brings you to the consideration that as oil is being processed to be a useful thing, like to provide petrol or kerosene, data would also have to be processed to become valuable and useful. Yeah. And so basically we would start with raw data, and then this would be processed in order to give us information. And information would have to be processed to provide us with knowledge, useful knowledge in particular. And that would have to be processed basically to create wisdom. So it's kind of a multi-step process. How this processing would have to happen, that's another question, of course, and it's absolutely non-trivial. It's often imagined that just use an AI and it would digest the data and basically filter it, and in the end there is wisdom. But I would actually doubt that. I think this process is a lot more difficult, and I think we haven't figured out actually how to turn raw data into wisdom.
Before I come back to wisdom and consciousness, I want you to step one step back to the book itself, because there's some big criticism about this book, because The Guardian wrote, criticism on technology without criticism on capitalism remains analytically blind. In this whole book, you find some parts when he discussed about the GAFA enterprises, and he won't point out, like Shoshana Zuboff, for example, surveillance and the things like that. What's your imagine? Would it be necessary to the critical capitalism, or is it so strong, how the Guardian will say, that he is analytically blind?
First of all, I think there are different versions of digitization or digitalization, whatever you like more. There's, of course, the surveillance capitalist approach that we know from Silicon Valley, for example. But also there's the state surveillance approach of countries like China. Yep. They are somewhat different. The other one certainly more oriented at governance and power and control, and the former one more oriented at profit maximization, but in the end also control and power, but in different ways. So this is important to say. So on a meta level, it would have been interesting to look at those different kinds of digital societies from the point of view of cybernetics, because that's what's behind it. So classical political systems are being governed by people. And then about 80 years ago, the idea came up that we could actually govern society through information flows. And that's called cybernetics. So basically both words, governance and cybernetics, have the same roots. They mean steering, basically. And so the idea of these people since about 80 years is that we could replace governance, which some people see as being defective, not efficient, and so on, by cybernetics. If we just had powerful enough computer systems and enough data, we could have information do the job for us. And this also gives us a better picture of why the things happen that do happen, which I think have not been very well digested by the public discourse. And in particular, this leads us to the debate of the role of mis and disinformation. Of course, mis and disinformation are part of the global information warfare that's part of the hybrid warfare that we're currently seeing. And it's related to some of the wars that are going on, but it's not restricted locally or to some countries. It's a global phenomenon. But beyond this, the idea is that we would be able to govern people not by convincing them that they should do this or that, but basically by triggering their behavior in certain ways. So the idea is that humans would be something like entity. Some people would even compare it with machines that are kind of stimulus response entities. That means an input of information triggers a behavioral output and certain ideas or emotions. And so basically it comes down to finding the right inputs to have the outputs, the behavior, thinking and feeling that somebody would like to have.
It is what normally called nudging.
Nudging is perhaps one of the elements, but it would not necessarily imply disinformation. But the point here that I'd like to make is, if it turns out that mis or disinformation is more effective in triggering the kind of behavior a government or a company would like to have, they would resort to mis and disinformation and not try to spend a lot of energy to convince us. And that has basically also caused this overwhelming flow of mis and disinformation, but it turns humans as conscious beings that reflect on reality and take responsible decisions in the sense of enlightenment. It turns them into machines that just respond to information stimuli, and basically it degrades humans towards a lower level existence.
Well, maybe just to illustrate what you just said about the, well, we came from the capitalist question. I'm not sure whether The Guardian is right. I think there's a lot of capitalism critique in the book. But it's not made explicit very often because he talks about totalitarianism. And that's the basic principle behind it. And everybody who reads that knows that this kind of totalitarianism is about making money. But coming back to the question, I'm not sure whether everybody is aware of. I'm not promoting the book now, but I want to show you this the cover and this image. It's actually a pigeon, and this pigeon has a name. It's called Cher Ami, and it was very kind of important at a certain time in the First World War because it made the way over the enemies, the front, by delivering messages to the other side, to the American troops. And so the American troops, they could be saved from being killed by the Germans. So that message was more or less vital for the American troops to survive. And so this pigeon, Cher Ami, was named. Became very famous, and the soldiers who survived the war even kind of celebrated it, and they did all kinds of anniversary things and so forth. And now some years and maybe even decades later, it came out that this was completely made up, the story. So there was never a pigeon called Jeremy. There was never any pigeon saving any American troops. So why is this put on the cover of this book? Because it's all about the question of truth and information.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference between truth and information. And what you just said is exactly the point, that in the situation where we are fed by information which is supposed to be the truth, but we are not enabled to any longer critique that information, then we are in trouble. And so the thesis of the book is actually, are we still aware of the fact that we might not be given the truth by all these information channels, but just a kind of ideology, indoctrination, whatever? So that's the reason for this pigeon on the book.
Yeah, I agree with Thomas. He does critique capitalism to a certain extent. He certainly targets a couple of corporations for specific actions around misinformation, disinformation, and the way their platforms have utilized the attention economy, taken that form of currency that we all have attention, we can place it in different areas, and trying to draw our attention to what they're trying to sell us in that sense. What he doesn't do so much, which might be also a fair criticism, is understand that AI is itself a capitalistic project. To understand that the reductionist impulse in the development of artificial intelligence, which is sort of there at the beginning, it's certainly there by the 70s and 80s when really the development of the concept of AI was focused on expert systems to be utilized in businesses to make more profit, to deal with large data sets solely because the quantity of information was becoming too much. And there was this direct line being drawn between information and money and profit in corporations. But even more so now, where it is entangled, and he does mention surveillance capitalism, entangled with observation of us and how we observe information, those two relationships. So I think he could have pushed it further by saying AI is itself a capitalistic project.
Yeah, I would somehow like to add, in fact, the criticism of the economic system and framework and conditions could have been a lot sharper. We all know that since the financial crisis in 2007-08, we haven't really sorted out the problem. The financial system is still an issue, unsolved after so many years, almost 20 years now. And this digital part of the economy is trying to basically fit in the budgetary holes, in a sense, you know, to make the profit, to keep that capitalist system alive. And we are also often talking about big data, and this big data is being created by data mining. But the question is, what are the data mines? And it turns out it's us. Now, it's our bodies, it's our life, it's our thinking, it's our friendships, it's our trust and solidarity, it's society. So it kind of, this digital capitalism is basically eating the substance of society altogether. And I think this makes it really an end-time capitalism, because it undermines the basis of our society and of our self-determined existence. This data is in the hands of very few. They make billions by basically turning social capital into profits. And as a result, basically we stand there with disrupted societies where we've lost trust and solidarity. Just think of hate speech, what it does with everyone. And this is basically creating a broken world. And from that broken world, however, they think there would be a new world emerging, like phoenix coming out of the ashes. And all those elements that remain, the people who make it through that time, basically, they would be rearranged in new ways, and most likely being ordered through AI And I'm not sure how that future would look like and whether we would want to live in that future.
I imagine it's techno-feudalism. Okay, so we imagine the pyramid of feudalism, and at the top used to be the king under God, and now it's the tech entrepreneur as the philosopher king at the top. And I'm imagining I'm somewhere down here. I'm not going to be very high up, but yeah, it's that sort of form of feudalism reimagined.
It's interesting that you say feudalism. I understood fuelism, but which would probably be a similar thing. So the system is fueled by this kind of information, new information, where we might, of course, have dynamics of exclusion all the time, even if we do not know it yet. So whether you are very downsized, so to say, or whether you're up, it's at least not according to the rules of a democratic society, and that makes, and I think that's a very crucial point of the book, that there is a narrative saying what we actually lose. I mean, you can take it very apocalyptic in a sense, but on a more smaller scale or level, what I actually agree very much with is that he says, well, democracy is at risk.
Absolutely.
And in a very, I mean, the book has been written before the last elections of in the US, but I mean, you can actually put that together, and that is what makes me a little bit frightened to really see his argument by, well, what happens with discourse, a free discourse. That's all his arguments. What happens with participation? So all the democratic elements which we are used to not only know about but also to practice, they might at a very early point almost, they might just vanish, and that made me think, how far are we actually? Are we still aware of our democratic rights and whether they are still kept, or are they already gone in a certain sense?
I think we have a parallel structure, right? So on the one hand, we still have parliaments, we have a legal system, we have media, we have science, and so on. But at the same time, this digital cybernetic system has grown, however you want to see it, and it's a data-driven, AI-controlled system. And this basically works in parallel, kind of to some extent behind our backs. We don't see information, but it's effective. And so basically there is a competition not just between capitalism and democracy, but there's also competition between the old governance system and the old ways our society worked with that digitally controlled system. And you know, the previous system kind of stays more or less the same in its power, but the digital system gets more powerful every year, exponentially so, and it's kind of foreseeable that there would be a transition point where politicians and everyone else like us would not be able to compete with that system, but that system would take over control of what happens on planet Earth.
There's one part in the book of Harari. He accelerates the idea there are not only echo chambers in which we are living in, we change our access to the world itself.
Yeah.
You agree?
Oh, absolutely. I've used this example of the veil before to say there has always been these things that come between us and so-called objective truth, different veils, different layers. And each technological advance that gives us access to information, access is variable, but in this particular moment, with AI being increasingly used as a user interface, I have a 13-year-old son who constantly wants to ask ChatGPT questions and get answers that, as we know, will likely be full of misinformation and disinformation, but it's yet another veil that's come down. We had search engines, then we had search engines prioritized by a particular thing, then we had AI summaries, now we have just going straight to the chatbot to get the truth. And those increasing layers just make it all that more difficult to understand what's going on in the world and what we're being told and what we're being seen. I don't know if people saw this the other day, that X's Grok, I'm really struggling to call it X all the time, but X's Grok has been manipulated recently so that any question you ask would start talking about the persecution of white people in South Africa.
Okay.
And this song about kill the Boers.
Yeah.
So someone had been playing behind the scenes. Now I have my suspicions who it was, but we will not know.
No.
To change the outputs of Grok. So every question accidentally now says this. And we don't, that's something that's obvious because every question changed, the answer was the same. We don't know what is being done behind the scenes when it isn't so obvious. So those kinds of concerns of our epistemic availability is a very, very big concern.
Do you agree when I say the connection to religion structures will have a new guardian? Like the AI is a new guardian to give people information about religion?
I don't know whether I would call it a guardian, but I mean there will certainly be a flow, and already that happens, of a lot of informations and also misinformations. That was the word Dirk used, of any kind of information, and then religion is of course also part of that. And so what is changing is actually in that sense the role of, let's call it, authorities. So where you actually could say, okay, this is a quote by the Pope or by a Protestant bishop or by, I don't know, a certain imam or so. And now this is not clear who's actually the authority behind it. So if you ask ChatGPT about whatever religious issue, you get a certain answer. And well, how can you tell whether this is in any sense true or legitimate to talk, or whether this is well put in the sense of is that a sufficient information about a certain issue and so forth. Yeah, of course. I mean, religion, like all other subjects, they're extremely kind of touched by and influenced by this new way, which makes it interesting for people who want to speak with a certain authority. Yeah. I mean, the Pope has Francis has really kind of tried to keep his authority by using his Twitter channel in the sense that he when you looked at it, I don't know how it is now, but when you looked at Francis Pope's Twitter channel, you found something like 20 million followers or something. And if you looked how many he followed, it was 8. 8 people. 8. Yeah. Just 8. And so you were wondering, who are the 8?
Yeah.
And well, very easy to answer. It's actually his other 8 channels in Twitter in the different languages.
Okay.
Okay, so this, we call that self-reference in a certain sense. But with this way, he tried to keep his authority by saying, I do not need anybody to follow because I'm the one people shall follow. But that's probably over, even for the Catholic Church.
Well, it's interesting. Something like 10, 12 years ago, I had a conversation with a scholar of religion who was adamant that the Pope would never be on Twitter.
And he's so active.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And I said he will be. He will have social media managers because it is a large institutional structure, and this is where they're going on social media. So of course you will. The argument from the other scholar was that the nature of decision-making in the Roman Catholic Church is slow, and Twitter is too fast. But of course he's not using it for decision-making, or Leo is not now using it for decision-making. It's for dissemination of materials. So of course he doesn't need to follow lots of people because he's not taking knowledge in, he's disseminating knowledge outwards. So there's a different structural need for social media in the Roman Catholic Church than perhaps other organizations. I mean, I look at religious improvisations and new religious movements, and absolutely they're in social media spaces because they're trying to connect and bring people together. It's a very different purpose.
For example, the first website of the Vatican has no email address, but everything you must know about Catholicism. So everything is clear.
Certainly in China, but also in the United States, there are people who are working on trying to create something like a digital god.
Yes.
I've been pointing that out back in 2013 in the NZZ, Google as God. The point is that people do argue that the world is in trouble. And basically, problems have become so complex that people cannot wrap their heads around it anymore, cannot find solutions. And therefore, we need to have a super intelligent system that would sort out the problems and find the solutions and fix planet Earth and humanity, basically. That's the idea. Some people would also say, why is not God helping us if he exists, and until he returns, we'll just build a super intelligent system. So how would that work, basically? This system would be fed with all the information that you could actually get hold of. And you could imagine it to be like an extension of ChatGPT. ChatGPT is reading all the text you get hold of. And for picture generation, all the pictures you can find. But in principle, the military has a lot more information, right? There's the Internet of Things, and there's the Internet of bio-nano things even. And now imagine you would feed all that information in a huge, even much bigger AI system, Feed it, have it learn on it, what are the patterns, what are the possible solutions that are known, and then basically tell the system, let's make planet Earth sustainable. Yep. Just make it happen and give it all the power, make it an autonomous system so nobody is responsible for what this system does, be it super intelligent or not, actually. So this kind of system they're creating, and the question is, how does it work? Does it work well? What are the possible concerns? And the justification is, human rights or not, democracy or not, we're faced with emergencies, with polycrisis. We need to save planet Earth, and that's why some people just don't care about the old ways. They think democracy is an outdated technology, basically. I don't agree with them on that. But in principle, that's why we have mass surveillance. And people have been told, you don't have to worry about it. If you're not a terrorist, nothing will happen to you. But this is totally misleading, because what it really comes down to is it's a manipulation and control system, So what they want to do with this digital God is they want to simulate the world, they want to simulate alternative futures, they want to be able to pick one of those futures, the optimal future, and then basically implement it. Yeah. Now, people, if they had a free will, they would mess up, of course, that plan. And so basically, in order to be able to implement this optimal future as they imagine it, you need to be able to control people's behavior, and for this they would need to control people's thinking. And that's what they're trying to do, actually, And so it goes far beyond filter bubbles, I would say. Some people have been using this notion of the matrix. Yeah. And you can imagine it a bit different from what you know from that cinema movie. In that cinema movie, there are these monitors somehow in the background, and of course, most of the time you don't see it's monitors. It's just a new world that you see. And in principle, they've done that to us. And those monitors are our smartphones and our computers. And basically, they have put at least one additional layer, you've been speaking about several layers, between the world and us, that are moderating our way of seeing the world, thinking about it, feeling about it, and we respond to that world that is presented to us based on what they call attention economics. So if they can grab our attention, and basically they have made it into our minds, and they can basically manipulate our minds and our behavior. And so this is how it works, and it's highly personalized. So it's not that there would be necessarily even millions or thousands of people in a filter bubble, but it could be absolutely personalized, you know. In the past, they have developed this kind of system basically for war and for psyops, that means psychological operations. So they wanted to be able to win wars against other countries. And they wanted to be able to influence individuals like some politicians or some spies or secret agents. And this is called social engineering. So they basically want to hack their thinking in order to hack, say, a computer or a political decision. And this has been restricted because of limited computer power and limited data to a few people in the past. But work on this has been ongoing for 20 years or even much more, and hundreds of billions have been spent on these kind of systems, I would say. And they've become so powerful that now they can scale it up and they can apply it basically to everyone. So this is what is happening, and this is why the world looks the same but feels so strange, because it really works absolutely different from it used to work. But you can't...
Just quickly, if you want a better science fiction parallel rather than The Matrix, which has its sort of like mind uploading element, think of the Westworld TV series, where by the 3rd season they introduced Jeroboam, which is a mastermind computer that has, through mobile phones, set up tasks for people, pushed them in particular directions, driven their attention in particular ways, because it's already predicted out the life path that they will take and how to adjust that and move that. So that's a slightly closer science fiction example.
I'm actually quite happy that afterwards we will have the chance for a glass of wine, because this is really tough stuff, what you're talking about. Yeah. I see the point, and Harari also has this tendency of a very dark apocalyptic vision of where everything will go to and head to. Still, I mean, we have to somehow cope with that, or think about how far are we in that process? Because now you were talking of science fiction films. We've in talks about Black Mirror, because they also have these kind of dark prophecies. And there is we've been in talks, Dirk, about all these scenarios for the future, and they sound very plausible, but even if they are plausible, and maybe they are much further than we know or aware of, we have to cope with what is going on, or we have to deal with what is going on, and be kind of, I don't know what, develop, that's probably your part of asking us, but developing a strategy or whatever measurements because we cannot just let the system run on its own. Yep. I suppose. I don't know.
You come to the point when you have to say everyone what we have to do against it, but it's in the later discussion. No, yeah,
but I more wanted to raise the question that if we keep in the mode of apocalyptic visions, yeah, it makes a difference.
I think you may have muted.
You said the truth, so
is that the truth? So I'm put off now.
Turned you off.
Anyway, so no, I just wanted to raise the awareness or question that if we're too strong on apocalyptic visions, it might also limit our imagination, yeah, of an alternative to that. Mm-hmm. That was more or less my argument.
But we have a strong structure in the book of Nexus called, Harari said, organisms are algorithms. Life is data processing. And the human being, not a free spirit, they are hackable in the system of technical algorithms. So, concerning what you have said, are we a hackable systems?
Yes, we are, but still he's wrong, I would say. And that has to do with his lack of knowledge of complexity theory, I would say. Because there are these emergent phenomena, and there's not just quantities that can be captured by data, but there's also qualities, and this is what we really care about in life, interestingly enough, right? So it's love, it's creativity, it's consciousness, it's friendship, it's solidarity, it's trust, these kind of things, belief. if we just focus on a data-driven society and optimize this, then all those qualities that we care about will be squeezed out, basically. And I think this is very much concerning.
I would like to point out that these are metaphors.
Sure.
And metaphors are important because they do shape how we behave and how we think, but metaphors also change. So you go back 200 years, and the dominant metaphor for talking about the human was the factory.
Yeah.
You go back 600 years before that, and the dominant form for talking about the human was astrological.
Sure.
So we have a shaping effect from assuming that he's right, and that these metaphors are currently valid, but we can come up with other metaphors. To go back to your point about let's not be too apocalyptic, because we want to think through how we get past this moment, and the formation of new, more positive narratives and metaphors is also a good idea. We can reclaim apocalypse as well, because as Robert Geraci points out in 2010 in his book Apocalyptic AI, of course, the religious interpretation of apocalypse is not always negative. We have the very strong narrative since the 1980s with Terminator and the cyber apocalypse of robots walking down the street and shooting us. But in a broader understanding of apocalypse, it can be the disruption of things to be born again. Right? So we could think about how we reclaim apocalypse to think about how we make a new society out of the disruption that they're creating in a more positive direction. Of course, that kind of acceleration into disruption and then rebirth is being used by these people as well. So we have to fight back with some of their own tools, I think.
Maybe just one point, coming back to Harari, he at least in in the final passages of the book, he also opens up for a more hopeful vision, and that I found interesting, saying, well, what we could do actually is build new other alternative networks. So if everything is about technological networks, nodes that are built due to economic reasons or whatever, or for political totalitarian reasons, we should think about how can we shape or even develop new forms of networks I'm not quite sure whether he means analog or digital networks, or maybe both. So that could be a point. Metaphor is network is of course also a metaphor, but it's also something that can be put into practice, I would say.
Exactly. This is exactly what complexity science does.
Okay.
Where these complex dynamical systems, they tend to self-organize, and there's an emergent outcome, a collective behavior, a macroscopic property of that system that comes out. But not always a desirable one. So if you want to change the outcome, this can be achieved by changing the interactions. We call this mechanism design. And changing the network also will change the interactions. I mean, by choosing an appropriate network structure, you will get the outcome that you want. By self-organization, you don't have to enforce it anymore. And this is the avenue we take, because it's based on bottom-up self-organization. It leaves freedoms. It's compatible with democracies. It's, however, not based on this idea that with all the data that we have, we would enforce control and force every component of the system to do a certain thing in order to implement the one route to that optimal outcome. So it's more like how evolution works. And I think that would be the better paradigm. So, I'm not pessimistic about digital technology at all. You would be perhaps surprised to hear that, but I think we would need to use it really in a different way. And that's what I also worked out in some of my works and books, how different we would have to look at technology, how differently we would have to use it so it works for us, and it's not turning against us. So there's these two different approaches, the top-down approach and the bottom-up one. And the bottom-up one, in order to make that work, we need to know about complex systems a lot more. Also, people in the Silicon Valley.
Time is running. two last questions. One question, it's very necessary, and I won't let you go for good answers for Harari. Harari's concept of non-consciousness, superintelligence, a plausible future scenario, or speculative acceleration? I pointed out, Harari wrote, since we do not understand how consciousness arises in carbon-based life forms, we cannot predict how this process might occur in non-organic beings. He called it beings. He draws parallels. Birds have developed flights by different routes than bats. Does that mean that machine could find alternative paths to superintelligence, possibly without consciousness? And how plausible is this argument?
So I would want to pick up the word superintelligence because it's
Sure.
used in lots of contexts, but without sort of unpacking exactly what we mean. So I think it's worth pointing out we already have superintelligence when it comes to AI, but it's very narrow. So something like AlphaGo can play the game of Go at a superintelligent level. It just can't go and make you a cup of tea afterwards.
Yeah.
So when people are talking about superintelligence, I think they're generally trying to assume some sort of artificial general intelligence. But at this stage, since we already have exponentially powerful AI, we already have, to all our knowledge so far, non-conscious superintelligence. So it's absolutely possible, but I'm caveating that by saying I'm leaving to one side the question of consciousness because it opens up that can of worms of saying, well, are we sure we're conscious already? Are we sure? Where do we ascribe consciousness at the moment? How has it changed historically? I'm a part of a demographic that wasn't always considered as intelligent or as conscious as the other half of the population, but we change and we shift and we expand our web of potential consciousness. I mentioned aliens, I'm going to mention them again. We have a lot of speculation about consciousness from other planets as well. We're starting to debate more and more the consciousness of animals. There is a large movement amongst the AI discussion to push against anything like octopus farming in particular, because they want to expand that definition of consciousness to include octopuses, octopi, I never know how to say that. So we've got these two elements he's bringing into conjunction. I'd argue superintelligence without consciousness, as far as we know, is eminently possible right now. Another way to put it is, David Runciman, a philosopher and thinker in Cambridge, also argues that we have non-conscious artificial agents with superintelligent power. They're called corporations. Right? Their impact around the world suggests something like that agential thing that we're talking about. So there's various paths into answering this question, but if you're going to talk about future speculations, I would always probably caveat by saying I'm agnostic. It sounds very interesting the way he describes alien intelligences coming, but it's not the first time people have had that conversation.
I'm actually concerning the question of consciousness. I'm still quite hopeful. The difference between a machine and a human being, like coming back to your example of the Go game, is that the machine does not feel any kind of joy when he wins, or he, she, it, or when he, she, it loses. So for me, a question of what could consciousness mean is connected to the questions: can machines develop any kind of emotions? And so far, at least as I know, they can't. They can pretend. They can suggest or hallucinate certain emotions, or like I'm sorry, or I feel deeply sad, whatever. But I think that could be something to work on the question of consciousness by looking what is the specific human way of experiencing emotions, feelings, expressing that emotions and feelings. And here I still see a huge gap between the machine and the human being. So that could be, from an anthropological perspective, be a very, very important and huge difference between what makes us different to machines. And I would feel very frightened if, I know they work on that already, that machines pretend a certain kind of emotional resonance towards the human beings.
Yeah.
We know that a lot of psychologists are behind the development of technologies, and that is what I fear. But that might be the strongest point of trying to understand the human being in difference to the machine, thinking about his or her emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should consider there are different kinds of intelligence. Most of it, of the time, we're thinking about, logic, scientific thinking, kind of higher level analytics and these kind of things, smartness, optimization. But there's also social intelligence, and there's emotional intelligence, and in the context of AI and robotics, there's not so much, I feel, discussion about it. And what really matters here is, perhaps we could build machines that do most of the things that humans can do better, more efficient. But that doesn't mean those machines would feel. And humans and also other beings do have feelings. They can feel pain. They can feel physical pain. They can feel emotional pain. They are emphatic, so they feel for others. And if a machine doesn't have that, and is very powerful, basically, it could cause a lot of pain without even noticing. It would be like an elephant in the porcelain shop. And this is exactly how currently I feel about these systems. They're relentless, they're ruthless, they just want to achieve their goals. And I think this is very dangerous, because if you apply them in the context of power, then just suppose what these machines could be used for. If you want, say, to win wars, to dominate the world, and you can increasingly know what people think, what kind of personality they have, and how you can trick them by using both their weaknesses and strengths to turn them against them, and force them to do things that they would otherwise not do by deceiving them and so on. And nobody is safe from that, no politician, And those technologies are definitely being used now in order to increase power. So the kinds of wars that we're seeing out there in Ukraine and elsewhere, they are with tanks, and to some extent they look a bit old-fashioned, but in the background there's artificial intelligence, and it kills. And it's not the only thing it does. And so, while on the surface wars don't have, it seems like they haven't changed so much. Of course, weapons are more powerful, more quick, more effective, and so on. But what really changed them qualitatively and fundamentally is AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Time is running. One last question with a hope that you can answer very shortly. Before we open the discussion to the audience, in one short and practical statement, what do you see as the most important step we must take to respond to the challenges Harari outlines?
I would say...
Practical?
Practical. Absolutely practical. The most practical thing we can do is discuss the subject, which is what we're doing here. We talked about networks, whether analog or digital. This is mostly analog with some elements of digital. I know we're streaming as well. But the more that we can come together in our networks as humans and speak about the subject of AI, where it's going, where we want it to go and where we don't want it to go, the more we can shape that future rather than accepting that it's just happening to us. So I don't agree with everything in the book. I like some of the specific examples. I find them very useful. But I think on the whole, what's good about the book is that it's a provocation for us to have this conversation right now and more conversations to come out of it further on as well.
I completely agree with Beth. I would just put one thing to that and add to it, which Harari also hardly ever mentions in the book. That's the legal perspective. I was wondering that he is actually not referring to the legal aspects of it. And I think next to our own kind of attitude in discussing things, we really have to make very strong that legal perspective.
Yeah.
I remember an example by Peter Kirchschläger, the colleague from Lucerne and ethics and digitality, and he said, "Well, I'm really wondering. They've been working on legal systems and legal regulations for bringing new medicine on the market, new pharmacy products, and it takes ages to get a product on the market." But never ever has anybody thought about, well, is this a certain app? Is that dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Is it in any sense, could it harm people?
Yep.
Could it be unhealthy and so forth? And I found that very insightful, that analogy to say, well, we did that with all the stuff in pharmacy, but nothing has been done on apps or other digital tools. So we also need a legal system working on these things.
Yeah, I agree. So there are
happy about that.
Digital accidents happening. There, I would even say, crimes against humanity happening, and people increasingly start thinking about these kind of things. But now let's end on a positive note, okay? So we are actually working on alternative ways of using digital technologies, different digital forms of society. Of course, we can now build everything. We can build digital fascism, we can build digital communism, digital capitalism, feudalism, whatever, new kinds of forms, but we can also build digital democracy. What we are very much interested in is value-sensitive design. So how can we build constitutional values? How can we build cultural values into the way systems work? And how can they support our values rather than fighting against them or ignoring them? So how to build systems to support freedom, human dignity, and democracy? How to build freedom tech? How to build technology for democracy? And I think what is really needed to make a change, a difference, is to start a new way of looking at technology. We need to start a new narrative, and we need to go away from this idea that if you just have all the data in the world, then we can identify an optimal outcome, and the right way to go is then to enforce that way. Because already that idea of optimality is totally flawed. Optimization is not going to create the best of all worlds. Co-evolution, I trust much more to deliver a society that's highly performing on so many different goals that we care about. So we need to go from control to coordination, to AI-based assistance, to a form of symbiosis and synergy, so it would support us in our goals. And I think we should go away from the controlling approach towards an approach of serendipity. So those systems, knowing our problems, knowing what we want, would help us basically improve our situation, the situation of others we interact with, and the situation of the environment, but without trying to enforce it, but rather than by creating opportunities that would otherwise not be there. And this would be a way to overcome the history machine that I think has been built, a ChatGPT for history, basically, that based on all the data that's being fed in this super powerful, perhaps not super intelligent, but super powerful AI that would try to steer course of planet Earth and humanity, and that would basically generate the future and thereby basically create history in a sense. And now this machine would have to be replaced by that serendipity approach that would create opportunities for everyone for a better future.
Now I want to open up for the audience. Statements, ideas. There's a microphone coming to you.
Perhaps some light would be good, because I'd like to see the audience also.
Thank you very much for your discussion. It was very interesting. when you were describing the world, like developments of China with the God and this controlling system where inputs triggering people to do some things and certain outputs, I expected first I get scared, and then I realized it's all familiar. It's all Catholic Church, it's all religion. We lived through this, it's not new. And then I became less scared, because actually as a society we have experience where there was one source of truth, let's say a big church and a priest, and somehow we developed that we become agnostic. So we have this experience, and I'm wondering, what do you think, how useful this experience would be for us to overcome the new religion which might become AI, and also such facts that every new generation become more familiar with religion and less religious. Mm-hmm. And then also the ones who are in Rome, for example, less religious than others because they have more insight of how it works. So technological elite will be less agnostic, and this might as well help less religious.
Let me understand your question exactly, and who do you address?
I probably for theology professional. How?
Oh, I was fearing that you're asking.
Yes. Help if you want.
I can do it too. Yeah.
I heard that there was said that it would be important that there will be theologists on the side of AI. But I see it's more important that there would be theologists who would protect us from AI and help.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I do not see the duty of theology to provide us from AI. I mean, to prevent us to use or whatever AI. I don't think that, I mean, the technological developments are as they are anyway, so we have to try to keep up in a certain sense with the dynamics of AI, and as Dirk just explained, to see where are positive counter practices towards that kind of dynamics, which are frightening and threatening the human being and dignity and all that. So I would not say that theology in any sense can put up the moral finger saying now we have the solution or we have whatever, this is all bad, or coming up with some kind of prophecy. I think we have to take it very serious. We have to sensitize like we do in religious education, a young generation about the use of AI and so forth. So I'm not in favor of these kind of big solutions. I don't know whether that helps, but no.
Yeah,
you can give a better theological answer maybe than I can.
I'm not a theologian, but I'd like to point out the following. Perhaps you still remember that Pope Francis was talking to the UN General Assembly back on the 25th of September 2015. And then he demanded the Agenda 2030, the sustainability agenda from the world. I told you that those systems that have been created are partially created in order to solve those sustainability problems and save the planet. So, you know, there's some connection actually between that agenda and the digital agenda, and it has not been pointed out so much. Interestingly enough, on the very same day, the 25th of September 2015, there was a Snowden revelation about a system that's called Karma Police. And this is a system which, in a surveillance-based way, would give karma points to people based on what they do. You know, and a variant of it has made it to the empirical test in China, the social credit score, where basically people would get plus or minus points for what they do or don't do. And that, in fact, does remind to some extent to religious belief on that are good deeds, and bad deeds would be punished, and good deeds, as we would get some reward eventually, at least after life. But this is kind of more the Old Testament's view on God, I would say, whereas a punishing God that sees everything. But yes, there is perhaps actually a link between Catholic Church thinking and that social credit score has been implemented in China, and by the way, elsewhere as well. There are also Western countries, so there have been different forms of that. On the other hand, I would say, there's also the New Testament, and that sheds a very different light on God. It's the loving God, it's for the forgiving God, and that's very much different from this all-knowing, punishing God that has been now perhaps implemented digitally, And perhaps we would have to find, we need to go into a new digitization, like analogously to the New Testament, perhaps, a digitization 2.0, which would have this loving approach and perspective towards humans and nature. And the question is, how can we build that? No idea digital technology can do it and how, but we should have this discussion.
I wanted to pick up your point about how you said that perhaps the move away from religion might help people also to move away from accepting systems that would control us in the way that you see religion controlling people. From a sociology of religion perspective, we are not becoming less religious. It's becoming less religious in specific areas, specific generations, specific demographics, but on the whole, around the globe, we only become more religious. So I don't think that kind of argument that we have this move towards or move away from religion towards other forms of rationality actually holds up. But what you can say is that we have experience in different kinds of controlling systems from actually before there was something that we would call religion. So perhaps in that sense, with that history, if we can pay attention to the fact that we are often under controlling systems and highlight them and make them well known, then we can push back against them. So having the knowledge that there are these systems, the social credit system, the karma system, all these different proposals and attempts to push us in particular directions, the more we speak about them, the more that we can actually decide that we don't want to be held under them.
I mean, just to add, because otherwise it stands that still in the room, I would not make that big difference between the Old and the New Testament in terms of the understanding of God. So, but that's a theological question. We can do a seminary together. So I would say that there is if you take the principle of love, of course, you of course find that also in the Old Testament, and there's on the other side, you also find quite dark sentences and sequences of punishing God in the New Testament. But the idea to take a certain understanding of the human being as a relational being, be it relational towards others, be it relational to God or to transcendence, could be a perspective for a counter practice to what we see at the moment. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions. Please short, and who do you address?
Thank you so much. My question is also for you, because you just said that you would expect law to kind of rule this whole topic. As far as I'm concerned, at least for Europe, we have data protection regulation, we have the AI regulation. So my question is, what's your expectation? Also, considering that if you would restrict all of it, like really, like legally, that would not comply with or be in line with the democratic values such as freedom, right? So what's your expectation there? Because from a European point of view, I would totally disagree with what you said in terms of laws not being there.
I mean, there are certain experiences and also talks and discussions about a UN declaration, and I think they've already started on, like what Dirk said, on value-driven AI principles, where they try to put human rights as... Yeah, but it's not been implemented yet. I mean, that's...
No such thing as implementation on that level. It's just that those private companies made a promise to actually comply with that. But again, like, what's your expectation? Because I mean, let's talk about what you mentioned in terms of, you know, AI being used in wars. That's not regulated. But can we? Is it a question, like, for legal institutions to do that? Because we also have international law, but there's no executive that makes sure that, you know, totalitarian states will comply. You know, so but I'm in law, so I naturally disagree with.
Yeah, I can only say, is there any alternative to try to get that kind of legal solutions? I don't see any alternative, which does not mean that I see that already in practice. But I mean, we have to. I mean, if things will go the direction that Dirk has now developed in terms of a kind of a global system of whatever, super intelligence or whatever you want to call it, we will all face consequences of that, and there has to be a certain kind of a legal understanding. I'm also quite doubtful looking into the situation like in China or in Russia or whoever is practicing now on that level, but I just do not see an alternative to that.
I would suggest we look at historical parallels on other technologies that have existential risks associated with them. So we have, if not international legal structures, we have international agreement on things like preventing nuclear holocausts.
Exactly, yeah.
We have international agreement on not cloning humans on the whole. There are, of course, actors around the world who have claimed that they have gone ahead and cloned human beings. They haven't claimed that they've dropped nuclear weapons on each other, because that would have a worldwide instant evidence and reaction. But when it comes to cloning, we have a moratorium around the world, mostly, that says we have decided this is as far as we go and we stop here. So we can have that kind of discussion, and the UN agreement, even if it doesn't have the teeth of the legality, it has buy-in from a lot of people to say we will go so far and stop. The problem, I would suggest, having said that there is some sort of agreement, is that we have also a culture amongst the techno-entrepreneurs who want to devise their own network states, separate to current geographical nation states. They might be physically located somewhere, but they're connecting them in terms of networks of digitality and coming up with new forms of non-democratic agreement running those states. And in those spaces, just as I said, there are actors who have claimed to have cloned human beings, such in China. In those network states that they're trying to develop in specific geographical locations, they can run ahead with AI in any direction that they want to go. So we have to regulate against things like network states, which are being described and implemented in various different locations, in order to control those kinds of hazardous actors. But again, it requires speed in keeping up with the developments of these kinds of new forms of community and culture.
We have 3 minutes to 9. At 9 we have to end, as I heard, but we have one question left. Please, very short, and who do you address?
Okay, so I referred to wrote it down, to the statement, democracy is at risk because of the technical feudalism. So my question is, who is at the top of the pyramid? Is it AI, or is it the Silicon Valley guys applying AI? So what is your take on the non-theological guys, maybe, if you want to address it?
Who do you want to address?
The non-theological guys, he said, so that's...
The okay, it's currently separate at the top together. We see this with Elon Musk's implementation of Doge, using both human actors and AI to assess the data sets from all these different government bodies in the US. Ultimately, though, if it's a transhumanist narrative, it's both in combination. So a post-human future where you are all, well, the people at the top are augmented with various technologies, cybernetic connections, mind-uploading technologies that Elon Musk and others are specifically working on. So you could say it's going to be both at some point.
Yeah. So perhaps it's not even a person, you know. perhaps to combine the two last questions, I'd like to say, theoretically speaking, the situation is clear. There are human rights, and our governments are responsible to protect them and to defend them, also against third parties like companies or other countries interfering with our human rights. They're responsible for that. But people have argued there is an emergency of planet Earth. And it's also connected to what they call long-termism. So they're trying to take the path that's optimal on the long term. And some people have argued that man is the true enemy of humanity and this planet. I obviously don't agree, but basically what has been done is the human rights charter has been in a sense replaced by a charter to protect nature. And that's the Agenda 2030 that has 17 goals, but human rights is not listed. And only recently, in the past few years, we've come back to recognizing that we have to combine it all. But before, the idea was now we have to create a system and an instance that would be above human rights in order to protect this planet. And that's why probably governments have not acted on protecting human rights that much. So it's all interconnected, I would say. And we are now learning that we have to combine it both.
So, the food is coming. Wonderful.
Good timing.
Good timing. I want to end this discussion about Harari with one last quote from his book. He's talking about strong self-correction mechanisms. This wisdom is much older than human history. It's elemental. It's a foundation of organic life. The first organisms weren't created by a genius or a god. They emerged through a process of trial and error. Over 4 billion years, even more complex mechanisms of mutations and self-corrections led to the evolution of trees, dinosaurs, jungles, and possibly us. Now we are surrounded in alien organic intelligence that could escape our control and put in danger not just our own species, but countless other life forms. The decisions we all make in the coming years will determine whether summoning this alien intelligence provide to be a terminal error or the beginning of a hopeful new chapter in the evolution of man. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your questions. And I'm hopefully seeing what's serving us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.